Hello there, and welcome to Sleep Science Chronicles. Tonight, we're going to drift beneath the surface of warm sunlit seas and watch as something extraordinary unfolds. Slowly, quietly, over centuries. We're going to witness the birth of coral reefs. Coral is neither rock nor plant. It is animal. Living, breathing, building. These tiny creatures create some of the most complex and beautiful ecosystems on Earth. Reefs that cover less than 1% of the ocean floor, yet are home to perhaps a quarter of all marine species. Tonight, there's nothing you need to do. Just let your body settle, let your thoughts soften, and allow these gentle explorations to wash over you like a warm current. If these calm, curious explorations help you unwind, consider liking and subscribing to the channel. It helps others find their way here too, one sleepy soul at a time. But for now, let your breath deepen, and let's descend beneath the surface together. Let's begin. Coral is an animal, not a plant, not a rock, but a living creature related to jellyfish and sea anemones. Each individual coral animal is called a polyp, and though many coral structures look like a single organism, they are actually colonies of thousands or even millions of these tiny animals living together, connected by living tissue. A single coral polyp is small, often just a few millimeters across. It has a cylindrical body with a mouth at the top, surrounded by tentacles. These tentacles are lined with specialized stinging cells called nematocysts, the same kind that jellyfish use to capture prey. The polyp sits inside a cup-shaped skeleton that it secretes around itself, a tiny fortress of calcium carbonate. Despite their appearance, coral polyps are carnivorous. At night, they extend their tentacles and feed on zooplankton drifting past in the current. The stinging cells fire microscopic harpoons that paralyze tiny prey, which the tentacles then guide toward the mouth. This is how coral survives in waters where nutrients are scarce, by being patient, efficient hunters on a miniature scale. Coral polyps are soft-bodied and vulnerable. The hard structures we associate with coral, the branching forms and massive boulders, are actually the external skeletons these animals build and live upon. The living tissue is just a thin layer coating the surface. Underneath lies the accumulated limestone of generations. Most reef-building corals belong to a group called scleractinians, or hard corals. But there are also soft corals, which have a more flexible internal structure and tend to sway in the current like underwater gardens. For now, we'll focus on the hard corals, the architects of reefs, the builders of underwater cities that grow so large they alter the geography of coastlines. A coral colony grows through a process called budding. One polyp divides to create two, and those two divide again, and the colony expands outward and upward. All the polyps in a colony are genetically identical clones, but they remain connected, sharing nutrients through a network of living tissue. In a sense, a coral colony is a single organism made of thousands of individuals, all working together. The mouth of a coral polyp leads to a simple internal cavity where digestion occurs. Nutrients are absorbed, waste is expelled, and what remains is used to build the skeleton. Coral doesn't have a brain, heart, or complex organs. It is elegantly simple, and yet, through cooperation and symbiosis, these simple animals create structures of breathtaking complexity. Coral polyps can retract completely into their skeletons during the day or when threatened. What looks like a bare, lifeless rock might actually be covered in thousands of animals, hidden and waiting. When night falls or conditions improve, they emerge again, tentacles extended, ready to feed. This rhythm of expansion and contraction, hiding and revealing, is the daily pulse of life on a reef. Some coral polyps are solitary, living alone rather than in colonies. These individuals can be surprisingly large, several centimeters across, but most reef-building species are colonial because there is strength in numbers and efficiency in shared resources. A colony can survive injuries that would kill a solitary polyp. If part of the colony is damaged, the rest continues growing. Coral tissue is translucent. In many species, you can see through the thin layer of living cells to the white calcium carbonate skeleton beneath. This transparency becomes important when we discuss the partnership with algae that gives coral its vibrant colors. The coral itself is often pale or colorless, a ghost wrapped around a stone framework. The tentacles of coral polyps vary in size and number depending on the species. Some corals have long sweeping tentacles that extend several centimeters. Others have tiny, barely visible tentacles that create a fuzzy texture on the colony's surface. These differences affect how and what the coral can catch and how it competes with neighbors on the reef. Coral polyps are radially symmetrical, meaning their body parts are arranged in a circle around a central axis, like the spokes of a wheel. This is a body plan shared by many ancient and simple animals, from sea anemones to jellyfish. It's an efficient design for a creature that stays in one place and needs to catch food from any direction. Coral reproduction is a spectacle, though often hidden from human eyes. Most reef-building corals reproduce both sexually and asexually, using different strategies to ensure survival and genetic diversity. Sexual reproduction creates new colonies. Asexual reproduction expands existing ones. Once a year, on certain nights dictated by the moon and water temperature, many corals release millions of eggs and sperm into the water simultaneously. This is called mass spawning, and it is one of nature's most extraordinary synchronized events. The timing must be perfect because coral eggs and sperm don't survive long in the open ocean. During mass spawning, the water fills with tiny pink or orange bundles of gametes, rising toward the surface like an underwater snowstorm in reverse. Each bundle contains both eggs and sperm from a single polyp. They float upward, break apart at the surface, and begin the process of fertilization. The sheer volume of gametes released increases the chances that eggs will meet sperm from different colonies, promoting genetic diversity. The timing of spawning is linked to environmental cues. Water temperature, lunar cycles, and even the time of sunset all play a role. Different coral species often spawn on different nights, staggered across a week or two, which may reduce competition among larvae and spread the genetic mixing across time. Fertilized coral eggs develop into larvae called planulae. These are tiny, ciliated creatures, elongated and covered in microscopic hairs that beat rhythmically to propel them through the water. A planula larva is smaller than a grain of rice, nearly invisible, and yet it contains everything needed to start a new coral colony. Planula larvae drift in ocean currents for hours, days, or sometimes weeks. This is the dispersal phase, when coral genes travel across distances that adult corals, fixed in place, could never traverse. Some larvae drift for miles. Others settle close to their parent colony. The length of the larval stage varies by species and environmental conditions. During their time adrift, planulae do not feed. They survive on energy stored in the egg, a finite resource. This means the larvae are under pressure to find suitable settlement sites before they exhaust their reserves. Many never find a place to settle and simply dissolve back into the food web. A planula is negatively buoyant once it's ready to settle, meaning it begins sinking rather than floating. It explores surfaces chemically, using sensory cells to detect clues about whether a spot is suitable. It needs hard substrate, the right amount of light, the right water chemistry, and ideally, the presence of certain types of algae or bacteria that signal a healthy environment. If a planula finds the right conditions, it attaches itself to the substrate and undergoes metamorphosis. It flattens against the rock, develops a mouth and tentacles, and begins secreting its first tiny skeleton. This moment marks the birth of a new coral colony. From here, every polyp that grows will be a clone of this original settler. Not all corals rely on mass spawning. Some are brooders, meaning they fertilize eggs internally and release fully formed larvae that are ready to settle almost immediately. These larvae spend less time adrift and tend to settle closer to the parent colony. Brooding species often dominate in more stable, sheltered environments where long-distance dispersal isn't necessary. Sexual reproduction is costly and risky, but it's essential for genetic diversity. Asexual reproduction through budding or fragmentation is safer and more reliable for expanding an existing colony. Together, these strategies allow coral to be both pioneering colonizers and long-term builders of reef structure. Coral larvae can delay settlement if conditions aren't right. They may remain in the water column longer than usual, waiting, searching. But the clock is always ticking. Eventually, the energy reserves run out, and the larva either settles or dies. The moment of settlement is critical. A larva's entire future depends on choosing the right spot. Too much shade, and it won't thrive. Too much current, and it might be swept away before its skeleton hardens. Too many competitors or predators, and it won't survive its first weeks of life. Coral larvae are drawn to certain types of surfaces. Crustose coralline algae, a hard pink or purple algae that encrusts rocks, is particularly attractive. This algae produces chemical signals that say, "This is a good place for coral." It indicates stable substrate, appropriate light, and the beginning of a healthy reef community. Once a larva attaches, it cannot move. This is it. The location chosen in those first few hours of contact will determine where this coral colony grows for decades, centuries, or even millennia. In this way, a microscopic creature drifting in darkness makes a decision that echoes through geological time. The newly settled polyp is extraordinarily vulnerable. It's tiny, soft, and exposed. Grazing fish, snails, and sea urchins can scrape it away before it has a chance to grow. Smothering by sediment is a constant threat. The first few weeks of a coral's life are the most dangerous it will ever face. To improve its odds, the young polyp grows quickly. It begins secreting calcium carbonate almost immediately, building a protective cup around itself. Within days, it may bud to create a second polyp. Within weeks, a small colony of several polyps may have formed. The faster it grows, the more likely it is to survive. Settlement often happens in waves. After a mass spawning event, suitable substrate may be covered with thousands of newly settled coral larvae. Competition begins immediately. Faster-growing species may overgrow slower ones. Predators and grazers thin the population dramatically. Of the millions of larvae released, only a tiny fraction will survive to become established colonies. Some coral species settle preferentially on dead coral skeletons. The hard, complex structure of an old reef provides excellent substrate for new coral. In this way, reefs build upon themselves, layer after layer, generation after generation. The past becomes the foundation for the future. Larvae can sense light, gravity, and water flow. These cues help them orient toward surfaces that face upward and receive sunlight, which they'll need once they acquire their symbiotic algae. Downward-facing surfaces, crevices, and caves attract different species, those more adapted to lower light and different feeding strategies. The settlement surface must be stable. Loose rubble, shifting sand, and soft sediment are all unsuitable. Coral needs something solid to attach to, something that won't move with the waves or bury the young polyp. This is why reefs grow best on bedrock, ancient lava flows, or the skeletons of previous reefs. Water chemistry matters too. Coral larvae are sensitive to salinity, temperature, and pH. They settle more successfully in water that's warm, clear, and chemically stable. Changes in these parameters can inhibit settlement or kill newly settled polyps before they establish themselves. In some locations, artificial structures like shipwrecks, concrete, or even sunken sculptures can provide settlement substrate for coral. These human-made surfaces, if placed thoughtfully, can become the foundation for new reef growth, accelerating the birth of reef communities in areas where natural substrate is limited. Once settled and growing, most reef-building corals form one of nature's most important partnerships. Tiny single-celled algae, called zooxanthellae, move into the coral's tissue and take up residence there. This symbiosis is the foundation of reef ecosystems. The reason coral reefs can thrive in nutrient-poor tropical waters. Zooxanthellae are dinoflagellates, a type of algae capable of photosynthesis. They live inside the cells of coral tissue, protected from predators and exposed to sunlight. The coral provides the algae with a safe home, access to light and nutrients from its own waste products. In return, the algae produce sugars through photosynthesis and share up to 90% of that energy with the coral. This partnership allows coral to grow much faster than it could through feeding alone. The energy from photosynthesis supplements what the coral catches with its tentacles, giving it the resources to build calcium carbonate skeletons at rates that create reefs. Without zooxanthellae, most reef-building corals would grow too slowly to form the massive structures we recognize as reefs. The vibrant colors of healthy coral come largely from the zooxanthellae living in its tissue. Different species and densities of algae create the brilliant greens, browns, golden yellows, and subtle oranges we see on reefs. The coral tissue itself is often translucent or pale, a canvas for the algae's pigments. Zooxanthellae are passed from generation to generation in some coral species. The parent coral packages algae into the eggs it releases, so that larvae already contain their symbiotic partners when they settle. In other species, newly settled polyps must acquire zooxanthellae from the surrounding water, capturing the algae from the environment. The partnership is sensitive to environmental conditions. When water becomes too warm or otherwise stressful, coral may expel its zooxanthellae in a process called bleaching. Without the algae's color, the white calcium carbonate skeleton shows through the translucent tissue, making the coral appear bleached. The coral is still alive, but without its algae, it loses most of its energy supply. bleached coral can recover if conditions improve quickly. The coral may take up new zooxanthellae from the water, or the expelled algae may return. But if stress continues for too long, the coral starves. It cannot sustain itself on captured prey alone, especially if it's also using energy to cope with warm water or other challenges. The relationship between coral and zooxanthellae is ancient. Fossils suggest that this partnership has existed for hundreds of millions of years, long enough for both organisms to become highly specialized for life together. Modern reef-building corals are so dependent on their algae that they cannot create reefs without them. Zooxanthellae produce oxygen as a byproduct of photosynthesis. During the day when the algae are photosynthesizing, oxygen levels in coral tissue can become very high. The coral uses some of this oxygen for respiration, creating a closed loop where the algae provide both energy and oxygen to their host. At night, the exchange reverses. The zooxanthellae stop photosynthesizing without sunlight and begin respiring like any other cell. They consume oxygen and produce carbon dioxide. Meanwhile, the coral polyps extend their tentacles and feed on zooplankton, capturing nutrients that will eventually be shared with the algae. Different coral species host different types of zooxanthellae. Some algae are better at tolerating heat, others at capturing light in deeper or murkier water. The specific partnership between coral and algae influences where that coral can live and how well it tolerates stress. This diversity of partnerships contributes to the overall resilience of reef ecosystems. Recent research suggests coral may be able to shuffle the types of zooxanthellae they host, favoring heat-tolerant varieties when water's warm. This flexibility could help coral adapt to changing conditions, though the process is still not fully understood and may not be fast enough to keep pace with rapid environmental change. The production of calcium carbonate is how coral transforms from tiny soft-bodied polyps into rock-like structures. This process is called calcification, and it happens continuously throughout a coral's life. The polyp extracts calcium and carbonate ions from seawater and deposits them beneath its tissue, building the skeleton from the bottom up. Calcification requires energy. The coral uses a combination of energy from zooxanthellae photosynthesis and energy from captured prey to power the chemical reactions that create limestone. The rate of calcification varies by species, with some corals growing just millimeters per year and others growing several centimeters annually. The skeleton a coral builds is not smooth. It contains ridges, walls, and intricate patterns that are unique to each species. These structures, called corallites, are like fingerprints. Scientists can identify coral species by examining the architecture of the skeleton, even in fossils millions of years old. As a coral colony grows, new polyps form and old ones die, but the skeleton remains. Layer upon layer of calcium carbonate accumulates, creating a permanent record of the colony's growth. You can think of it like tree rings, though the patterns in coral are more complex and don't form annual bands as clearly. Coral skeletons are porous, filled with tiny channels and spaces. This structure makes them lighter than solid rock, which is important because massive colonies can weigh many tons. The porosity also creates habitat. Small creatures live inside the skeleton, hidden in the maze of chambers and tunnels. The chemistry of seawater affects calcification. Coral builds its skeleton more easily in water that is saturated with calcium carbonate. As ocean chemistry changes, particularly as carbon dioxide increases and water becomes more acidic, calcification becomes more difficult. The coral must use more energy to extract the materials it needs. Some corals build massive boulder-like structures. These are appropriately called massive corals, and they grow slowly but steadily for centuries. A massive coral the size of a car might be hundreds of years old, growing just a centimeter or two each year, patiently accumulating limestone. Other corals grow in branching forms like underwater trees or bushes. Branching corals tend to grow faster than massive ones, sometimes adding 10 or 15 centimeters per year. They can colonize space quickly, but their delicate structure makes them more vulnerable to storms and physical damage. There are also plating corals that grow in thin, flat sheets, often layered like shelves or tiles. These corals maximize their surface area to capture light for their zooxanthellae. They're common in deeper or shadier areas where light is limited and efficient. Light capture is essential for survival. Encrusting corals spread across surfaces like living paint, growing outward in all directions, but remaining thin. They're often found on rocks, rubble, or other hard surfaces, and they can outcompete other corals for space by simply growing over them. Encrusting growth is a good strategy in high-wave environments where tall or branching structures would be torn away. The growth form of coral is partly determined by genetics, but environment also plays a role. The same species might grow in a branching form in calm, protected water and in a more compact, sturdy form in areas with heavy wave action. The coral responds to its conditions, building a skeleton that balances growth with survival. Coral colonies compete for space on the reef. When two colonies of different species grow close together, they may engage in what looks like warfare. Some corals extend long sweeper tentacles at night, reaching out to sting and damage neighboring colonies. These tentacles can be several times longer than the feeding tentacles, specialized weapons in the slow battle for territory. Other corals fight by growing over their neighbors, shading them from light and eventually smothering them. This is a patient strategy that takes months or years, but on a reef where space is limited and valuable, the ability to overtop a competitor can mean the difference between thriving and dying. Some corals produce chemicals that inhibit the growth of nearby competitors. These allelopathic substances create a zone of exclusion around the colony, a chemical boundary that other corals cannot cross. The reef becomes a patchwork of territories, each defended not with claws or teeth, but with stinging cells and chemical warfare. Despite the competition, coral colonies can also fuse. If two colonies of the same species grow close enough and are genetically compatible, they may merge their tissues and become a single larger colony. This fusion allows coral to repair damage, fill gaps, and create more robust structures that resist storms and disease. The shape of a coral colony influences how water flows around it. Massive dome-shaped corals create calm zones in their lee, areas of reduced current where sediment can settle. Branching corals create turbulent flow that keeps sediment suspended and washes food particles past their tentacles. The architecture of the reef shapes the physical environment in intricate ways. As individual coral colonies grow and multiply, they begin to create structure. What started as scattered polyps on bare rock gradually becomes a continuous framework of limestone. This is the beginning of a true reef, a three-dimensional habitat that rises from the seafloor and creates new niches for life. The first reefs are shallow and simple, just a rough pavement of coral covering the substrate. But over years and decades, as colonies grow upward and outward, the structure becomes more complex. Crevices form between colonies. Overhangs develop. Small caves and tunnels appear in the growing architecture. This increasing complexity attracts more life. Fish find shelter in the crevices. Invertebrates hide in the shadows. Each new niche is colonized by species adapted to exploit it. The reef becomes not just a structure, but an ecosystem, a living community shaped by the coral's patient construction. The pace of reef growth varies enormously. In ideal conditions, with warm, clear water, abundant nutrients from upwelling, and healthy coral populations, a reef might grow several centimeters per year. In less favorable conditions, growth might be measured in millimeters per decade. Reef building is patient work, accumulation happening on timescales that dwarf human lifetimes. Over centuries, coral reefs can grow thick enough to completely cover the original substrate. What was once volcanic rock or ancient limestone becomes hidden beneath meters of new coral growth. The reef is a geological structure now, not just a biological one, a mass of rock created by living creatures. Storms regularly damage reefs, breaking off coral branches and toppling massive colonies. But this destruction is also part of reef building. The broken fragments often survive, settling into new positions and growing into new colonies. Storm rubble fills gaps between living coral, creating solid substrate. The reef grows not just upward, but outward, expanding its footprint with each storm cycle. There are three main types of coral reefs, classified by their relationship to land. Fringing reefs grow directly along coastlines, attached to the shore with little or no lagoon, separating them from land. These are the youngest and simplest reef formations, the first stage in reef development. Barrier reefs lie farther offshore, separated from land by a lagoon of open water. The lagoon can be narrow or kilometers wide, shallow or surprisingly deep. The reef itself forms a barrier between the protected lagoon and the open ocean, breaking the force of waves and creating calm water near shore. Atolls are ring-shaped reefs that surround a central lagoon with no island in the middle, or only a small one. These formations seem mysterious until you understand their origin. Atolls begin as fringing reefs around volcanic islands. As the island slowly sinks or erodes away over millions of years, the reef continues growing upward, eventually forming a ring that outlines where the island used to be. Charles Darwin proposed this theory of atoll formation in 1842, based on observations during the voyage of the Beagle. He realized that atolls were the final stage in a long process of island subsidence and reef growth. Modern research, including drilling into atolls, has confirmed his hypothesis. Beneath the living surface of an atoll lies volcanic rock, the ancient core of a vanished island. The transition from fringing reef to barrier reef to atoll can take millions of years. It requires the island to sink slowly enough that the coral can keep pace, growing upward toward the light as the land beneath sinks into the sea. If subsidence is too fast, the reef drowns in deep water. If subsidence stops, the reef may eventually reach sea level and stop growing upward. Reef lagoons are worlds of their own. Protected from the full force of ocean waves, they provide calm nursery habitat for young fish, seagrasses, and soft sediments. The water in lagoons is often warmer than the open ocean, and sometimes more turbid, carrying sediment stirred up by gentle currents. Channels and passes cut through many reefs, allowing water to flow between the lagoon and the open ocean. These channels are created and maintained by currents, particularly the the strong tidal flows that rush in and out as sea level rises and falls. The channels become highways for fish and other marine life moving between lagoon and ocean. The outer edge of a reef, the reef crest, faces the full power of ocean waves. This is where coral must be most robust. Here you find massive sturdy corals and encrusting forms that can withstand the constant pounding of surf. The reef crest acts as a breakwater, absorbing wave energy and protecting everything behind it. Just beyond the reef crest, the reef slope descends toward deeper water. This zone receives less wave energy, but still gets abundant light. Here, coral diversity is often highest, with many different species growing in different forms, creating a complex mosaic of shapes and colors. As the slope continues downward, light diminishes. Below about 20 or 30 meters, depending on water clarity, there's not enough light for most zooxanthellae hosting corals to thrive. But some corals adapted to low light continue growing into the twilight zone, extending the reef deeper. These deep water corals tend to grow in plating forms to maximize light capture. Eventually, you reach the depth where light is insufficient for zooxanthellae. Here, reef building stops. Below this point, you might find solitary corals that don't rely on photosynthetic partners, or cold water corals that use different strategies. But the great tropical reefs need light. They are fundamentally tied to the sun, to photosynthesis, to the partnership with algae. The reef creates its own weather in a sense. The massive structure of coral affects water flow, creating upwelling zones where deep, nutrient-rich water rises toward the surface. These upwelling areas can be more productive than the surrounding ocean, attracting plankton and the fish that feed on plankton. Reefs also generate sound. The crackling and popping of snapping shrimp, the scraping of parrotfish beaks on coral, the grunts and croaks of fish communicating, all create an acoustic environment. This soundscape travels through water for considerable distances. Coral larvae drifting in open water may actually navigate toward reefs by listening for these sounds. The smell of reefs, or more accurately, the chemical signals reefs produce, also travels through water. Coral releases dimethyl sulfide, a compound that creates a distinctive chemical signature. Larvae and other organisms can detect this signature and use it to find reefs, turning the ocean into a landscape of chemical waypoints. Day and night, the reef transforms. During the day, coral polyps often remain retracted protected inside their skeletons. The zooxanthellae photosynthesize, invisible engines powering the reef. Fish are active, grazing on algae, picking at coral, hunting smaller fish. The reef seems busy, colorful, almost frenetic. At night, the reef changes character. Coral polyps emerge, tentacles extended, filling the water with thousands of tiny searching arms. Nocturnal fish emerge from hiding, while daytime fish tuck into crevices to sleep. Bioluminescent organisms may begin to glow. The reef becomes a different place, softer, stranger, lit by different lights. Many fish sleep on reefs, though not in the way mammals sleep. Some wedge themselves into crevices. Others bury themselves in sand. Parrotfish secrete a mucus cocoon around themselves at night, a sleeping bag of slime that may mask their scent from predators. Sleep on the reef is about finding safe spaces in a habitat where hunters never stop hunting. The reef provides nursery habitat for countless species. Many fish that live as adults in open water or deep zones return to reefs to spawn. Their larvae develop in the protected environment of the reef, feeding on the abundant microscopic life. Once grown, they may leave for deeper water, but the reef was their birthplace. Cleaning stations are special locations on reefs where certain fish and shrimp offer cleaning services to other fish. Cleaners eat parasites, dead skin, and debris from larger fish that visit the station. These relationships are mostly peaceful, even when the clients are predators that could easily eat the cleaners. The benefit of cleaning outweighs the potential for a quick meal. Some fish use the reef structure to aid in hunting. They may chase prey into crevices where escape routes are limited, or use coral formations to stage ambushes. The three-dimensional complexity of the reef creates advantages and challenges for both predator and prey. Parrotfish are among the most important grazers on reefs. They scrape algae from coral and rock surfaces using their fused beak-like teeth. In the process, they consume some of the calcium carbonate substrate. This material passes through their digestive system and is excreted as fine sand. A single large parrotfish can produce hundreds of kilograms of sand per year. The white sand beaches of tropical islands are, in large part, parrotfish poop. And more than that, they're the ground-up skeletons of coral and other calcifying organisms, processed through the guts of fish and deposited on the seafloor or washed up on shore. The sand itself is reef material, redistributed by biological and physical processes. Sea urchins also graze on reefs, using their 5-part mouths, called Aristotle's lanterns, to scrape algae and other material from hard surfaces. In healthy ecosystems, urchins are kept in check by predators. But when predator populations decline, urchins can become so numerous that they overgraze the reef, preventing new coral from settling and established coral from growing. Sponges are common on reefs, growing in an astonishing variety of forms and colors. Some are encrusting, others tubular, vase-shaped, or branching. Sponges filter water, extracting bacteria and organic particles too small for most other organisms to capture. They can filter enormous volumes of water, with some species processing their body volume of water every few seconds. Many sponges contain chemical compounds that deter predators. These compounds have attracted scientific interest because some show promise as medicines, including potential anti-cancer and antibiotic properties. The chemical diversity of reef sponges reflects millions of years of chemical warfare and defense. Sea stars, or starfish, are common reef predators. Some species specialize in eating coral. The crown-of-thorns starfish, for instance, feeds exclusively on coral polyps. During population outbreaks, these starfish can devastate large areas of reef. They climb onto coral colonies, extrude their stomachs out through their mouths, and digest coral tissue externally. Anemones, close relatives of coral, also live on reefs. Unlike coral, anemones are usually solitary and don't build skeletons. They anchor to rock or burrow into sand and capture prey with their tentacles. Some anemones host clownfish in a symbiotic relationship, where the fish gain protection from the anemone's stings, and the anemone may benefit from the fish's presence. The clownfish and anemone partnership is possible because clownfish produce a mucus coating that prevents the anemone's stinging cells from firing. The exact mechanism is still debated, but the result is that clownfish can live among tentacles that would kill other fish. They shelter in the anemone, venture out to feed, and may defend their host from anemone-eating fish. Moray eels hide in reef crevices during the day, their long bodies coiled in dark spaces with only their heads protruding. At night, they emerge to hunt fish and octopuses. Despite their fearsome appearance, morays are generally not aggressive toward humans unless provoked. They're an integral part of the reef's predator guild. Octopuses are intelligent hunters on the reef. They can change color and texture instantly to blend with their surroundings, becoming nearly invisible. They hunt at night, creeping across the reef and probing crevices with their arms to find sleeping fish or hiding crabs. Octopuses have excellent problem-solving abilities and can learn to open containers, navigate mazes, and recognize individual humans. Reef sharks are often present, though they're typically small species that feed on fish and invertebrates rather than large prey. White-tip reef sharks, black-tip reef sharks, and gray reef sharks are common. They rest in caves or under ledges during the day and hunt at night. Their presence indicates a healthy reef ecosystem with intact food webs. Sea turtles visit reefs to feed. Green sea turtles graze on algae and seagrass. Hawksbill turtles use their sharp beaks to reach into crevices and extract sponges, their primary food. Loggerheads crush hard-shelled prey like conchs and crabs. Each turtle species has its niche, its particular way of using the reef's resources. Manta rays and eagle rays glide over reefs, elegant and seemingly effortless. They feed on plankton and small fish, filtering them from the water as they swim. Mantas may visit cleaning stations where smaller fish pick parasites from their skin. These gentle giants can have wingspans of several meters, yet they move with remarkable grace. Nudibranchs, or sea slugs, are among the most colorful creatures on reefs. These shell-less mollusks come in an extraordinary variety of patterns and forms. Many are brightly colored, as a warning that they're toxic or distasteful. Some nudibranchs eat coral, others consume sponges, and some are specialized to feed on anemones, somehow neutralizing and storing the anemone's stinging cells for their own defense. Mantis shrimp are remarkable predators despite their small size. They have the most complex eyes in the animal kingdom, with 16 types of photoreceptors compared to our 3. Some species use club-like appendages to smash their prey with strikes that can break glass aquarium walls. Others use spear-like appendages to impale fish and soft-bodied prey. Christmas tree worms are small polychaetes that bore into living coral. Only their feathery feeding appendages, arranged in spirals like tiny Christmas trees, are visible at the surface. They filter feed, extracting plankton from passing water. When disturbed, they can retract completely into their tubes in a fraction of a second. Barnacles, despite looking like mollusks, are actually crustaceans related to crabs and shrimp. They cement themselves permanently to hard surfaces, including coral, and feed by extending feathery legs to catch plankton. Once settled, a barnacle will never move again. It grows, feeds, and reproduces from that single spot for its entire life. Tube worms build calcium carbonate tubes on reef surfaces and inside crevices. Like barnacles, they filter feed, extending delicate feeding structures into the current. Some species create tubes that spiral or grow in clusters, adding their own small contribution to the reef's structure. The surfaces of coral are not smooth at close inspection. They're covered with microscopic life, diatoms, cyanobacteria, tiny copepods, and countless other organisms. This biofilm is itself a microecosystem, a layer of life that cycles nutrients and provides food for some grazers. Algae compete with coral for space on the reef. Fleshy macroalgae can overgrow coral if conditions shift in the algae's favor. This is why grazers like parrotfish and sea urchins are so important. They keep algae populations in check, preventing them from smothering coral. When grazer populations decline due to overfishing or disease, algae can take over, transforming coral-dominated reefs into algae-dominated ones. Coralline algae, however, are beneficial. These hard, calcified algae cement reef structures together, filling gaps and creating a more solid framework. They also contribute to reef building in their own right, adding their calcium carbonate to the reef's mass. Coralline algae can be pink, purple, red, or white, often forming beautiful patterns on reef surfaces. Some algae live in mutualisms with coral, but not inside the coral tissue. They grow on the skeleton in areas where the coral tissue doesn't reach, or in recently dead areas of the colony. This creates a complex mosaic of living coral, dead skeleton covered in algae, and the contributions of countless other organisms. The age of a coral colony can sometimes be estimated by examining its skeleton. Growth bands, similar to tree rings, form in some species. These bands reflect variations in growth rate related to seasons, water temperature, and other environmental factors. Scientists can drill cores from massive corals and count the bands, revealing colonies that have lived for centuries. Some massive coral colonies are among the oldest living organisms on Earth. Brain corals and boulder corals in the Caribbean and Pacific have been found to be over 500 years old. A few may be approaching or exceeding 1,000 years. These ancient corals were alive before European ships crossed the Atlantic, witnessing centuries of change in the ocean around them. The growth of these ancient colonies has not been steady. Years of stress, storms, disease, or unfavorable conditions show up as narrow bands or gaps in the skeleton. Years of optimal conditions show as wider bands. The skeleton becomes an archive, a record of environmental history written in limestone. Coral reefs are not static. They're constantly being built and broken down, grown and eroded. Bioerosion is the process by which organisms break down reef structure. Parrotfish scraping, sea urchin grazing, sponge boring, and worm burrowing all remove material from the reef. In healthy systems, coral growth exceeds erosion, and the reef expands. When conditions shift and coral growth slows or stops, erosion can outpace construction. The reef begins to crumble, losing its structure. This is one way reefs die, not with a sudden catastrophe, but with a slow wearing away as the balance tips from building to breaking. Boring sponges are particularly effective bioeroders. They tunnel into coral skeletons, weakening the structure from within. A colony that looks solid on the surface may be riddled with sponge tunnels inside, fragile and prone to breaking. The sponges benefit from the protected space inside the coral, and they don't necessarily kill the coral, though they weaken it. Some worms and mollusks also bore into coral. They create tubes and chambers in the skeleton where they live, protected from predators. Over time, a coral colony can become as much Swiss cheese as solid structure, filled with the tunnels and chambers of countless organisms. Even in death, coral continues to provide habitat. Dead coral skeletons are colonized by algae, sponges, soft corals, and other organisms. They provide attachment points for new coral larvae. The structure remains, and with it, much of the reef's three-dimensional complexity. A reef doesn't instantly disappear when coral dies. The skeleton lingers, slowly eroding, but still shaping water flow and providing homes. Reef recovery after disturbance depends on many factors. If water quality is good, if there are healthy coral populations nearby to provide larvae, if grazers keep algae in check, a damaged reef can recover within a decade or two. Branching corals, with their fast growth, often pioneer this recovery, quickly establishing new colonies that begin rebuilding structure. But if conditions are poor, recovery may be slow or fail entirely. Without larvae arriving to settle, without grazers to control algae, without the proper water chemistry, a damaged reef may transition to an algae-dominated state. This alternative stable state can persist indefinitely, preventing coral from reclaiming space. The concept of resilient is important in understanding reefs. A resilient reef can absorb disturbance and recover to something close to its original state. Resilience comes from diversity, from healthy populations of key species, from good water quality, and from connectivity to other reefs that can supply larvae for recolonization. Coral spawning connects reefs across distances. Larvae released from one reef may drift to another, maintaining genetic diversity and allowing recolonization after disturbances. Reefs are not isolated islands. They're nodes in a network connected by the currents that carry coral larvae across miles of open water. The currents that transport larvae also bring nutrients, oxygen, and temperature variations. Reefs exist in a moving ocean, constantly bathed by flowing water. This flow is essential. Stagnant water would quickly become depleted of oxygen and nutrients, and coral polyps would suffocate or starve. Water temperature is one of the most important factors determining where reefs can grow. Reef-building corals generally require temperatures between 23 and 29 degrees Celsius. Below this range, their growth slows dramatically. Above it, stress increases and the risk of bleaching rises. This temperature requirement limits reefs to tropical and subtropical waters. You find the greatest reef development between roughly 30 degrees north and 30 degrees south of the equator. This is why coral reefs are associated with warm, sunny destinations, with azure waters and tropical islands. Salinity also matters. Coral requires fully marine conditions, with salinity close to that of normal seawater. They cannot tolerate freshwater or highly variable salinity. This is why reefs don't grow near river mouths, where freshwater discharge dilutes the ocean. The boundary between freshwater and saltwater is a boundary reefs cannot cross. Light penetration depends on water clarity. In very clear water, light can reach depths of 30 or 40 meters, allowing coral to grow deeper. In turbid water, full of sediment or plankton, light may penetrate only 10 or 15 meters. The depth limit of reef growth moves up and down depending on how clear the water is. Sediment is one of coral's enemies. When sediment settles on coral tissue, it blocks light from reaching the zooxanthellae. It can also physically damage the delicate polyps. Coral has some ability to shed sediment by producing mucus or using tiny hairs called cilia to sweep particles away. But constant heavy sedimentation overwhelms these defenses. This is why reefs often struggle near areas of coastal development. Construction, agriculture, and deforestation increase erosion, and sediment-laden runoff flows into the ocean. The sediment smothers nearshore reefs, sometimes killing them entirely. The reef retreats, surviving only in areas where water clarity remains high. Coral disease has become more prevalent in recent decades. Diseases with names like white plague, black band disease, and rapid tissue loss disease can kill coral quickly. These diseases may be caused by bacteria, fungi, or viruses, and some appear to spread more easily when water temperatures are elevated or when coral is already stressed. When disease strikes, the living tissue of the coral dies and sloughs away, leaving bare white skeleton that is quickly colonized by algae. The disease may spread across a colony, killing it entirely, or it may kill patches, leaving the colony weakened and vulnerable. Once disease arrives on a reef, it can spread from colony to colony, sometimes affecting multiple species. Coral mucus serves many purposes. It traps sediment and helps remove it from the colony's surface. It contains antimicrobial compounds that may defend against disease. It provides food for some reef organisms when the mucus sloughs off and drifts away. The mucus layer is the coral's interface with the world, its first line of defense, and its means of interacting with the environment. Some fish actually feed on coral mucus, nibbling at the colony's surface without damaging the polyps. Other fish are more destructive, biting off chunks of coral to access the zooxanthellae inside or to get at worms and other organisms living in the skeleton. Butterfly fish often specialize in coral feeding, using their long snouts to reach into crevices. The crown of thorns starfish outbreaks mentioned earlier are particularly devastating because a single starfish can consume several square meters of coral per year. During outbreaks, tens of thousands of starfish may infest a reef, and the combined feeding can strip away most of the living coral. The reef becomes a field of white skeletons. Why these outbreaks occur is still debated. Some scientists point to nutrient runoff from land causing plankton blooms that feed starfish larvae. Others suggest that overfishing of starfish predators like the Triton snail allows populations to explode. It may be a combination of factors, a perfect storm of conditions that allows starfish numbers to surge beyond what the reef can sustain. After a starfish outbreak, reefs can recover, but it takes time. Fast-growing corals may recolonize within a decade. Slow-growing massive corals may take 50 years or more to regain their former size. The structure of the reef changes during recovery, typically becoming dominated by faster-growing species. Natural reefs have existed for hundreds of millions of years. The first coral reefs appeared in the Ordovician period over 400 million years ago, though those ancient reefs were built by different kinds of coral than modern reefs. The corals that build today's reefs, the scleractinians, appeared in the Triassic period roughly 240 million years ago. Over geological time, reefs have expanded and contracted. During warm periods, reefs spread toward the poles and occupied more of the ocean. During ice ages, when sea levels dropped and temperatures cooled, reefs retreated to smaller areas near the equator. The Great Barrier Reef as we know it today is relatively young, perhaps 8,000 years old, though reefs have existed in that region for much longer. Ancient reefs have been found high in mountains, far from any ocean. These are fossilized reefs, lifted by tectonic forces as continents collided or as Earth's crust buckled and rose. The limestone that forms much of the world's mountain ranges was often created by coral reefs millions of years ago, now transformed by heat and pressure. When you hike in certain mountain ranges and see limestone cliffs, you may be walking on ancient reef. The rock beneath your feet was built by coral polyps in a vanished sea. Fossils in the limestone preserve the shapes of coral and other reef organisms, ghosts of ecosystems that thrived when the world was warmer and these mountains were seafloor. Petroleum, too, is often associated with ancient reefs. The porous structure of reef limestone creates excellent reservoirs for oil and gas. Organic matter trapped in and around ancient reefs was transformed by heat and pressure into fossil fuels. Many oil fields around the world are located in or near fossil reef structures. The calcium carbonate cycle is fundamental to reefs. Coral extracts calcium and carbonate ions from seawater to build skeletons. When the coral dies and the skeleton begins to erode, some of that calcium carbonate dissolves back into seawater, while some becomes sediment. Over millions of years, vast amounts of carbon have been locked away in reef limestone. Reefs are carbon sinks in this way, removing carbon dioxide from the water and, indirectly, from the atmosphere. However, the calcification process itself releases some carbon dioxide, so the net carbon balance of reefs is complex and still studied. What's clear is that reefs play a role in the global carbon cycle, storing carbon in solid form that may last for millions of years. The structure of reefs creates different zones, each with its own community of organisms. The reef flat, the shallow area behind the reef crest, may be exposed at low tide. Only the hardiest corals survive here, along with algae and organisms tolerant of extreme conditions like high temperatures and intense sunlight. Deeper on the four-reef slope, conditions are more stable and diverse. This is where you often find the highest coral diversity and the most complex communities. The slope provides a gradient of conditions from shallow and bright to deep and dim, and different species sort themselves along this gradient according to their needs. The back reef, protected behind the main reef structure, often has different conditions than the fore-reef. Water may be calmer but warmer, and sometimes more turbid. The coral species here are those adapted to these conditions, often including more branching and delicate forms that couldn't survive the wave-pounded fore-reef. Patch reefs are isolated coral formations that grow in lagoons or on sandy bottoms away from main reef structures. These are like oases in the sand, providing habitat in areas that would otherwise support little life. Patch reefs start the same way as any reef, with larvae settling on hard substrate, but they remain isolated rather than merging into continuous reef. Sea level changes have profoundly affected reef development. During the last ice age, sea level was over 100 meters lower than today. Many reefs were exposed to air and died. As the ice melted and sea level rose, reefs grew upward, tracking the rising water. The reefs we see today are relatively young, having grown during the past 10,000 years of stable sea level. If sea level rises slowly, reefs may be able to grow upward fast enough to keep pace, but if the rise is too rapid, reefs can drown, finding themselves in water too deep for their zooxanthellae to get adequate light. This has happened at various times in Earth's history, and it's a concern for the future as sea level continues to rise. Reefs protect coastlines from erosion. The reef structure absorbs wave energy, reducing the force of waves that reach the shore. Without the reef, beaches erode more quickly, and coastal areas are more vulnerable to storm damage. This is why the loss of reefs has consequences not just for marine life, but for human communities living near the coast. The economic value of reefs is substantial, though difficult to quantify. They support fisheries, provide tourism income, protect shorelines, and may be sources of new medicines. Estimates of the global economic value of coral reefs run into hundreds of billions of dollars annually. Yet this value is rarely captured in market prices or in decisions about coastal development and ocean management. Some reefs have adapted to unusual conditions. The reefs of the Red Sea, for example, tolerate water temperatures that would bleach most coral elsewhere. These corals may harbor genetic variants that confer heat tolerance, and scientists study them hoping to understand how coral might adapt to warming oceans. Other reefs grow in surprisingly turbid water, or in areas with variable salinity, or in cooler waters than typical for reefs. These marginal reefs show that coral has more flexibility than sometimes assumed. Different populations have adapted to local conditions, and this diversity may be crucial for reef survival as conditions change. Coral larvae can cross ocean basins. Genetic studies reveal connections between reefs separated by thousands of kilometers of open water. A larva drifting in the right current at the right time might cross from one side of the Pacific to the other. These long-distance dispersal events are rare, but over evolutionary time, they maintain gene flow and allow coral to colonize new areas. The Indo-Pacific region has the highest coral diversity on Earth. The waters around Indonesia, the Philippines, and Papua New Guinea contain hundreds of coral species. This area is sometimes called the Coral Triangle, and it's thought to be a center of origin and diversification for coral. From here, species have spread to other parts of the Indo-Pacific and even crossed to the Atlantic. The Caribbean has fewer coral species than the Indo-Pacific, and the dominant reef-building corals there belong to different genera. Caribbean and Indo-Pacific reefs have been separated for millions of years, and they've evolved somewhat independently. Yet they're similar in many ways, a testament to the consistent evolutionary pressures shaping reefs wherever they occur. Cold water corals exist, but they don't build reefs in the same way tropical corals do. These corals live in deep, dark water where there's no light for photosynthesis. They rely entirely on captured food, growing much more slowly than tropical reef corals. Cold water coral structures can be extensive, but they don't have the same three-dimensional complexity or rapid growth as tropical reefs. The sounds of a healthy reef carry for surprising distances. Coral reefs are among the noisiest natural environments on Earth, though humans rarely hear it, because most of the sound is at frequencies we don't detect well underwater. The snapping of shrimp, the scraping and munching of feeding fish, the movements of countless organisms all combine into a rich acoustic environment. Larval fish and invertebrates may use these sounds to navigate. Studies have shown that larvae of some species move toward reef sounds, using the acoustic signature to find suitable habitat. This behavior makes sense. Reefs produce sound. Open ocean does not. So sound is a reliable cue for finding the reef from a distance. Coral spawning is synchronized not just by species, but often by location. On Australia's Great Barrier Reef, the mass spawning typically occurs a few days after the full moon in late spring, when water temperatures have risen. The timing is so predictable that researchers and tourists plan trips specifically to witness the event, diving in the dark to see the underwater snowstorm of coral gametes. The release of gametes turns the water milky. So many tiny packets of eggs and sperm are released that visibility drops to nearly zero. At the surface, the gametes accumulate in slicks, pink or orange or white, depending on the species. These slicks drift with currents and winds, spreading potential new corals across miles of ocean. not all gametes succeed. Most are eaten by fish and filter feeders that converge on the spawning site. It's a feast that many species time their own reproduction to coincide with, taking advantage of the sudden abundance of food. Only a tiny fraction of the gametes survive to fertilization, and only a tiny fraction of those become larvae that successfully settle. The odds are staggering. A single coral colony might release millions of gametes, yet perhaps only one or two from that colony will survive to produce a new colony that itself reaches reproductive age. This is why coral produces such vast numbers of offspring, why the water fills with gametes during spawning. The strategy is to overwhelm predators and compensate for terrible odds through sheer abundance. Some fish have evolved remarkably specific relationships with coral. Gobies live in the branches of certain corals, defending their host from predators like crown of thorns, starfish, and butterfly fish. The coral provides shelter, and the fish provides protection. Both benefit, and the partnership is so specific that certain goby species are found only on certain coral species. Damselfish also defend coral territories, though sometimes they farm algae rather than protecting the coral directly. They maintain small patches where they cultivate specific types of algae, aggressively chasing away other fish that might graze there. These algae gardens happen to provide some benefit to nearby coral, creating incidental partnerships. The symbiosis between coral and zooxanthellae is not unique. Many other reef organisms host photosynthetic partners. Giant clams have zooxanthellae in their mantles, the colorful tissue visible when the clam is open. Sea anemones host similar algae. Some sponges and other invertebrates have also formed these partnerships, all independently evolving relationships with photosynthetic algae. This convergence suggests that the strategy works exceptionally well in nutrient-poor tropical waters. By partnering with organisms that can capture energy from sunlight, these animals gain access to a nearly limitless energy source. The sun shines every day, and photosynthesis converts that light into sugars that fuel growth and reproduction. Coral fluorescence is a phenomenon where coral proteins absorb light and emit it at different wavelengths, creating glowing colors. Some corals fluoresce naturally, appearing to glow under certain lighting. The function of fluorescence is still debated. It may help regulate light reaching the zooxanthellae, protecting them from too much light, or it may serve some other purpose we don't yet understand. Under ultraviolet light, fluorescence becomes dramatic. Reefs photographed under UV light reveal hidden patterns and colors invisible under normal light. These images show that the reef contains layers of visual information beyond what we typically see, a reminder that our perception captures only part of what exists. Coral mucus also fluoresces in some species. The mucus layer glows under UV light, creating halos around coral colonies. This fluorescence might serve protective functions, or it might be a byproduct of other chemical processes in the mucus. The underwater world is full of such mysteries, phenomena we observe but don't fully understand. Some fish have evolved to blend with specific coral backgrounds. They match not just the color, but the texture and pattern of the coral they live near. This camouflage is so effective that the fish becomes nearly invisible when it rests on or near its coral. Predators swim past without seeing prey just inches away. Octopuses take camouflage further, changing not just color but skin texture in seconds. They can mimic coral, algae, sand, or rock, creating patterns that match their background almost perfectly. The speed and precision of this transformation is remarkable, controlled by specialized cells in the skin that expand or contract to change appearance. The chemical complexity of reefs is staggering. Organisms produce thousands of chemical compounds for defense, communication, and competition. Many of these compounds have never been fully studied. Each species has its own chemical signature, its own arsenal of molecules, shaped by millions of years of chemical warfare and cooperation. Scientists continue to discover new compounds from reef organisms, some with potential medical applications. Anti-inflammatory drugs, pain medications, and potential cancer treatments have all been derived from reef organisms. The chemical diversity of reefs represents a library of natural compounds, many still unknown to science. Coral can regenerate from fragments. If a branch breaks off during a storm, it may settle on the bottom and continue growing as a new colony. This is cloning, asexual reproduction that allows rapid expansion after disturbances. Some restoration projects now use this trait, growing coral fragments on underwater structures and transplanting them to damaged reefs. The practice of coral gardening involves growing coral in nurseries, then outplanting it to restoration sites. Fragments are attached to structures where they grow for months or years before being transplanted. This accelerates reef recovery in areas where natural recruitment is slow. It's labor-intensive and doesn't address underlying problems like water quality, but it can help rebuild reef structure. Some corals are more resilient to stress than others. These hardy species may become more common as conditions change, shifting the composition of reef communities. The resulting reefs may be less diverse, but more tolerant of warm temperatures or poor water quality. They're different from historical reefs, but they're still functioning ecosystems, providing habitat and coastal protection. The concept of winner and loser species describes how reefs may change. Winners are species that tolerate stress well and may expand their range. Losers are those highly sensitive to stress that may decline or disappear. Over time, reefs may come to be dominated by winner species, changing the character of the ecosystem, but maintaining some reef function. Coral reefs will continue to exist in some form, though they may look different from the reefs we know. They've survived mass extinctions, ice ages, and dramatic changes in ocean chemistry before. They're remarkably resilient over geological time. What's uncertain is whether they can adapt quickly enough to keep pace with the rate of current changes. The partnership between coral and zooxanthellae has been around for hundreds of millions of years, surviving multiple mass extinction events. During the Permian extinction, the worst in Earth's history, reefs collapsed, but coral and their algal partners survived. They eventually rebuilt reefs in the millions of years that followed. This deep history suggests that while individual reefs and even whole reef systems can be destroyed, the fundamental partnership is robust. Coral and zooxanthellae have weathered planetary catastrophes before. They carry within their cells the legacy of survival through unimaginable changes. Today's reefs are the latest chapter in a story hundreds of millions of years long. The corals growing on reefs right now are descendants of organisms that lived when dinosaurs roamed the Earth, when all continents were joined in Pangaea, when life itself was younger and the ocean was a different place. Each coral polyp, tiny and seemingly simple, carries that vast heritage. Each one is a link in a chain stretching back through geological ages, and each one continues the process of building, one skeleton at a time, one generation at a time, slowly creating the structures that will become the reef. The birth of a coral reef is not a single moment, but a process that unfolds over centuries and millennia. It begins with a larva smaller than a grain of sand, drifting in darkness, searching for home. It continues with that larva's transformation into a polyp, the first skeleton forming, the first buds creating siblings. Years pass, decades, centuries. The colony grows. Storms break pieces away. The pieces survive and grow. Other larvae settle nearby. Colonies meet and compete or fuse. The structure rises from the seafloor inch by inch, foot by foot, creating walls and caves and gardens of stone. Fish arrive. Invertebrates colonize the growing structure. The reef becomes an ecosystem, not just a geological formation. It creates its own weather patterns, its own chemical environment, its own soundscape and smell. It transforms the ocean around it. And still it grows, imperceptibly slow from a human perspective, but continuous, relentless, patient. The reef doesn't hurry. It builds as the ocean allows, as sunlight permits, as the partnership between animal and algae provides the energy to transform seawater into stone. This is how reefs are born. Not with drama or sudden creation, but with quiet accumulation. With millions of tiny polyps doing what they've done for hundreds of millions of years, building, growing, creating. Now as we drift back toward the surface, imagine the reef beneath. The countless polyps, most hidden in their skeletons, waiting for night. The fish moving through the architecture of stone. The whole community pulsing with life, built on a foundation created by tiny animals working together. You are connected to this process. The calcium in your bones is chemically the same as the calcium in coral skeletons. Both of you extract it from your environment and use it to build structure. Your body and the coral's body both rely on partnerships, symbioses, communities of cells working together. The oxygen you're breathing right now may have been produced by zooxanthellae on some distant reef, released into the ocean, and eventually making its way to the atmosphere. The carbon dioxide you exhale may one day be incorporated into a coral skeleton, locked away in limestone for millions of years. We are part of the same systems, the same cycles. The reef is not separate from you. It exists in the same world, shaped by the same chemistry, built from the same elements that form every living thing on this planet. As you rest tonight, know that somewhere in warm tropical waters, coral is spawning. Larvae are drifting. Polyps are feeding. Skeletons are growing. The slow, patient work of reef building continues in the dark, in the quiet spaces beneath the waves. The reef doesn't need you to watch. It doesn't need acknowledgement or appreciation. It simply is, doing what it has done for longer than our species has existed, building, sheltering, growing, creating structure from water and light and time. And in that patience, in that continuity, there's something deeply calming. The reef reminds us that some processes happen slowly, that beauty accumulates gradually, that the most impressive structures are built incrementally, day by day, year by year, century by century. You don't need to build anything tonight. You don't need to create or achieve or accomplish. You can simply rest, like the coral polyps hidden in their skeletons during daylight. You can simply be breathing, existing, part of the vast web of life that connects everything from the smallest polyp to the largest reef, to you, lying quietly in the dark. the reef will still be there tomorrow, still growing, still building, still offering shelter to countless forms of life. It doesn't hurry, and neither should you. Let your breath slow to the rhythm of gentle waves lapping at a reef. Let your thoughts drift like plankton in a warm current. Let yourself settle, the way a coral larva settles onto stone, finding the right place, the right moment, and simply beginning. If you happen to still be awake, you can go ahead and watch the next video now. Another journey awaits, another quiet exploration into the living world. But if your eyes are heavy, if sleep is pulling you down into its gentle depths, then go. Rest. Dream of warm water and colored light and tiny animals building mountains. The reef will still be there when you wake, still growing, still beautiful, still patiently doing what it has done since long before we were here. Good night.